In this lesson, we'll talk a little bit about UVs and how they relate to our textures and materials. So when we're starting to get into more complex textures and materials that we add to our objects, when we're working with polygon objects and even NURBS, the computer needs to know how to apply those materials to what we see on the screen. And this is where UVs come in. So let's go into a window and check out the UV texture editor. And we actually, I believe, have a beginner's guide to UVs if you want to check that out, and a visual guide for a more basic explanation. But here in the UV texture editor, you can see this sort of grid. We have these numbers going from 0 up to 1 at this solid line, and then 0 to 1 on this line going in this direction. And these directions are what we call U and V. So here we have U, and here we have V. Okay, so the UVs are basically, we're telling Maya how we want our polygons to accept the texture. So if we have a square texture, we can think of it as filling one of these blocks. Okay, so a flat 2D texture that we've painted or a picture that we've taken, we can think of it as filling up this space here. Okay, so if we select a piece of NURBS geometry, for instance this wing, you can see that we can see kind of a grid here, but it's all grayed out. Okay, and the reason for that is that the UVs are really just tied to the geometry itself. So it's always going to take up this entire grid. Okay, because this piece of geometry really is just a flat sheet that is twisted and combined and folded over on itself to create this particular shape. So you can think of it as always being kind of a flat square sheet that is configured in slightly different ways in order to create, you know, things like cylinders. It's twisted around on itself. To create a sphere, it's twisted around just like a cylinder, and then the ends are pinched in to create the sphere. But you don't really have the ability to change the UVs, which is why those ramps work so well on our NURBS fan blades, because it takes up this 0 to 1. So if we had the color, I'll go ahead and turn this on, you can actually see that we have the black over here on the end of one side of the ramp, and then we have the gray in the middle and the black on the other. So we know that this is going to be, in this case, the top, and this is going to be the bottom, so it applies perfectly, just the way we want it to. But when we're working with polygons, it's a little bit different. So let's go ahead and select maybe this piece. Now right now, it just has kind of default UVs, which don't really make much sense. So if we were to go in and add a material to this, so let's go into the Hypershade. Let's create a new material, and we'll just call this temp. Okay, and we really want to see how the texture is being applied. So we're going to jump in here and under color, add a new node, and let's add a checker. So we'll add a checker pattern here, and let's apply this to our piece, our rib piece. Okay, so you can see up on the top it sort of looks okay, but down here you can really see that's not what we want. We want to have nice square blocks, because if we don't have nice square blocks in here, that means whatever texture we do apply to it is going to be really, really distorted. Okay, and you can see how that texture is being applied here. So here we have our checkers, and then in our UVs saying, okay, this particular face, which corresponds to this face, whatever is underneath this in our texture is going to be applied here, which in this case is that little section. So we want to basically create a nice, clean, unwrapped version of our polygons inside these tiles. So to do that, we'll go to polygons, and there are different methods of creating UVs. You can use planar mapping, which would use a plane to project that down. Okay, you can, if it's a spherical shape, you can use spherical mapping. A lot of times I'll just use automatic mapping, which will automatically unwrap and break apart all these different pieces. So you can see now everything is looking good as far as the distortion goes, but we have a lot of seams now. The seams are going to be areas where the polygons are broken apart. So you can see now all these polygons correspond to the polygons on our object, but they're now broken apart. Okay, now I can right click and I can choose edge or UV to manipulate any of these. These are called shells. So if I select a UV, you can see it's green, and that corresponds to the vertices in the viewport. I can right click, control right click rather, and say to shell, and then I can use my transform tools to move it around. And you can move these anywhere you want. You just want them to end up together in a tile where you want them to be used. Okay. Now we can also, if I right click on the edges and I click on, let's say, this edge, you can see it turns sort of orange, and we have another orange edge that's been highlighted. That is to let us know that in the 3D world, that is where that edge actually connects. We can do the same thing here. Okay, so what we want to do is start to sort of sew these together in ways that make a little bit more sense to us. So we can, for instance, grab this piece on the front. Okay, you can see how it corresponds to this front piece, and we can start to maybe add the sides. So I could come in here and add the side, and I can go move and sew, which will take one of these objects and move it to the other one. In this case, it took the object we had selected and moved it. I can select this and move and sew. At any time you can select your UVs and actually do an unfold, which will try to match up the shape of the polygons with the polygons here and just make it a little bit less distorted. And so we can start to create a UV layout here. So what I might want to do is create a separate shells for this piece and this piece and this piece. And so we can start to select those and see where those are. So here is going to be one of those middle pieces, and we can select the polygons on the side, move and sew to add those little bits. Same thing here, and add the bottom of it here. Now once you start to select one edge on one side and it selects the edge on the other side, that means you've got a complete loop and it's wrapping around. So you don't want to move and sew that. You want to leave that open, because everything you want to do here, you want it to be nice and flat. Okay, and we can come in here, and here's the one on the back. We can sort of do the same thing here. Select our edges and just move and sew until we get to the other side. And eventually you'll end up with just a few shells, and those seams will match the seams that you have here, which is fine. You're going to have seams no matter what. You cannot really avoid that at all, because you're taking a 3D object and smashing it down, unwrapping it, kind of like unwrapping an orange. Or maybe taking a cardboard box apart, flattening it out. All right? So the main thing to keep in mind is when you're working with NURBS, you're not going to be able to manipulate the UVs like this. But polygons, you're typically going to need to if you're going to start to apply different kinds of materials or different kinds of textures that you want to be applied across the surface. You'll typically want to create the UVs for that. Okay? Let's go ahead. I think we have some time here, and we'll just finish this up. You can select these and see where those are, what those are associated with. So I'm going to go ahead and start to combine these together, just so the number of shells that we have and the number of seams that we have is minimized. If you're not sure where something goes, you can always select the edges, and it'll kind of let you know where those go. You can see how this piece needs to come down here. And then these pieces I'll just go ahead and leave alone. And then this piece, if you want to connect it up in here, you can, and then we can sort of unfold it. And then you just want to arrange everything. So assuming we're going to have one texture for this, I want it to all be within this, what you call 0 to 1 space. And we can arrange it different ways. And the idea with arranging these is you want to squish everything together as much as you can, and you want to use as much of that tile as you possibly can. Okay, because all that area that you're looking at in there is going to be pixels. And so you're going to have a finite number of pixels that you need to use. So you need to dedicate as many of those pixels as you can to your actual geometry rather than space between them that's not being used. Okay, so if you have texture space that nothing is covering, then that's kind of wasted space in your texture in a way. So you just want to make sure to think about that. And just thinking ahead, I'm actually going to take these pieces here, and I'm going to go ahead and leave these up at the top, and I want to actually shrink everything down a little bit that's not those center pieces. So I can go ahead and scale these down a little bit, and I'm going to take these And I can rotate them and scale them down a little bit. And do the same thing here, rotate it. And I'll scale it down. And I just want to put them on the two halves of the tile. And I'll show you why a little bit later. But I just want these to be up at the top. Okay. And I want to actually line these up a little bit more. And we can modify these a little bit later, but just kind of line those up. Okay, so there we have a UV layout for our polygon object. Okay, again, on the UV, on the NURBS, you don't have to do that. On the polygons, you will. So I also want to come in and create, I'm going to go ahead and create a UV layout for this grill piece, and I'll do that before the next lesson. I'll just, again, use automatic mapping and just coming in and sewing all of those pieces together. All right, so now in the next lesson, let's take a look at how we can start to use some procedural textures. And we've sort of already touched on some of those, the checker and some of the other textures, but we will take a look at how we can start to create variation with some procedural textures in addition to the ones we've seen before, the ramp and so forth. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that next.